Good afternoon. Ooh, it's louder than I thought. My name is Patsy Hicks. I'm completely blinded at the moment, so I know you're out there, but it's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm Director of Education here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and so pleased to have our trio, Los Tres Grandes, on stage this afternoon. Artist Narsiso Martinez. Oh, let me do one thing first because I always forget this. Please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done that. Although the rings have gotten more innovative, we still don't want to hear them. So thank you. This afternoon, artist Narsiso Martinez and writer Alex Espinoza share their intersecting stories of family, place, identity, escape, and witness. In equally powerful narrative drawings and narrated words, these two artists create connections in situations and generations where disconnections often speak louder than truth or tenderness. Narsiso Martinez's drawings, and you can see them upstairs, or one of them upstairs, as well as we'll have some in the slides, and mixed media installations include multi-figure compositions set amidst agricultural landscapes, painted, drawn, and expressed in sculpture on discarded produce boxes collected from grocery stores and taken from his own experience as a farm worker. His work focuses on the often invisible people performing the labors necessary to fill produce sections and restaurant kitchens and our own tables. As he says, I want them to know they are someone, they are important. Alex Espinoza describes himself as a queer writer with a disability. He was born in Tijuana, Mexico, and raised in Southern California. His debut novel, which he shared with us on this stage, Stillwater Saints, was published to wide critical acclaim. His second novel, The 5 Acts of Diego Leon, was the winner of a 2014 American Book Award. Other awards include fellowships from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference and the National Endowment for the Arts. His essays, reviews, and stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, LitHub, and NPR. Alex teaches at the University of California, Riverside, where he serves as the Tomas Rivera Endowed Chair and Professor of Creative Writing. They are joined in conversation by longtime colleague and friend Melinda Gandara, who teaches literature, art, and culture in the American Ethnic Studies, Chicano Studies, and Art History departments at Santa Barbara City College. And I think some of those students are out here. Raise your hand if you're, yes. Yay. She also serves as an adjunct professor at the Institute of American Indian Art, teaching the arts of Central and South America and Native American art history. Please join me in welcoming Melinda, Alex, and Narsiso back to this museum stage as they share their take on breaking the cycle and rewriting the story. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Patsy, for that wonderful introduction. And it's so wonderful to have former students and students in the audience. And I can't wait to get started with two wonderful men that I have greatly admired and used in my classroom, which is so exciting. So this makes it very real for us. What I wanted to do is I just wanted to segue into the idea of some themes that connect with both your work. Mm. And when I talk about themes, we're talking about the fact that for so many of us, we're talking about the invisible made visible, right? Yeah. And the unmasking and the heroes behind some of the masks. And I just wanted to throw those out there as some ways of pulling the works together. Yeah. But also the fact that there are also secrets. And those secrets, how they can even come about. The fact that when we talk about where we grow our food, for many of us, it is still a secret. Or when we drive down Highway 101, how many of us avert our eyes and don't watch the strawberry pickers? And yet we buy the strawberries very readily. So I just wanted to open up the dialogue and discussion on that invisibility made visible in both your works.
That's good. Can you see some? Good. I don't know. Do you want to take it? Sorry. Well, what was that again? About the invisible being made visible. Well, in my work, I think that there is a disconnection between the people who own these orchards or these who own these companies and the people who actually work in the fields producing those products for the companies to make money off. And I think when I try to make farm workers visible through oil paintings, it wasn't working. All the attention was towards the actual media that I was using. I guess it's because it has so much history, the oil paintings. But as soon as I started drawing them on the boxes, I feel like the conversation started. And that connection that I couldn't find before started to happen, that invisible connection or, disconnection started to become more prominent in the work because I was able to, because of the work, you could see the labels on the boxes and the people who work in the fields. People started, well, at least when I started in the classroom, right? My professors, my other students, they started seeing that connection or that disconnection, and we started talking about it, And I feel like the more we talked about it, the more visible became the farm workers, And that made it my goal from there on to keep working on it, to just keep the conversation going. I started noticing that not only nowadays, but also in the past, throughout history, farm workers have been erased pretty much. I've been looking at vintage labels where you see all these beautiful landscapes, but there is no trace of farm workers. So I made it my goal to make the farm workers visible.
Yeah. Very powerful. Do you mind if I just put one of the images up so we can just see the underlying cardboard boxes? You can see.
Yeah, so that image of the mission is actually from a brand called Mission. And that image is actually from a box where there's no trace of farm workers. So that made it my goal to contrast that with actual farm workers. There's a farm worker here on the right. And that also, the king holding the wine bottle is also from a brand called King Cole, I believe it's called. So yeah, it's just this idea of contrasting farm workers and the companies that attracted me.
And it's powerful to even see the word precious cargo and somehow ignore the people who are actually working to put all that together. I think it's extraordinary. It's so interesting. So academically, when I talk about your work, I go back to the work of Tomás Ibarra Ferrazo, and he talks about risquache, right? Making do with what you have, and to be able to flatten a cardboard box and to make that your canvas is a very powerful way of taking that invisible and making it much more visible. Oh, they're just very powerful. And so the cherries that are up there, is that cherries that I'm seeing?
Well, when I work, many times I find images on the boxes that I use, and oftentimes I try to make them sort of invisible, right? To make it visible, I hide them and I try to make it look as a product, not necessarily as a specific kind of product, but as a product. And just to make a point that all these companies produce all this produce that goes all the way to the people, but behind it there is the farm workers. So yes, they could be strawberries, they could be an apple, it could be anything that is a product of the fields. This actually was a tomato landscape, a tomato orchard, and I turned it into sort of like a vineyard, like a grapevine, and you could see some of the leaves are tomato leaves, but there are also like the grapes hanging from there. So it's like a mixture of things that I put in there just to make a point.
Yeah. Oh, very, very profound. And it's so interesting because, when we think about California in particular, it's the breadbasket of the world. Those of us, I was raised in the central San Joaquin Valley, and that is a place where the push and pull, right? Pulling in the work and yet pushing out. So much of our history is about that push-pull factor. And I just think it's so powerful to actually have to sit with this. For some, it may be discomfort, I think.
I mean, when I started this piece, it just goes through at different stages, right? Like I start with one idea and it just grows to a different idea based on the images that I see on the boxes. Like it started with the mission, right? But then I thought of the wine tasting that is very trendy, And I thought, what if I don't know, I just was thinking the mission, the grape orchards and how trendy it is to go wine tasting. What if I make a comment about that since I'm turning this into a grapevine? And I look at this image of the king holding a tray of produce. So I made it into sort of like suggesting the wine tasting, sort of like inviting to have a glass of wine, And I don't know. I just thought about precious cargo, which was on a box. I believe it's a garlic box. It made me think of the slavery and people who were brought here by force on ships, and it made me think of indigenous people who were brought the other way around, I guess, from Mexico to Europe, right? And just I left that. I white out everything else but the words. And things that start triggering me, I thought of the missions and Catholicism, and I thought of America Tropical. You're familiar with that mural, and there is the center image on the church. It's the center image of Siqueiros, which I borrowed from America Tropical. Excuse me, I just thought of.
I'm going to point it out because so right over here.
Yeah, I just saw that opportunity to bring that piece of history back into the piece. I feel like as an indigenous person, it affects me, and I want to tell the story. I feel like I like Siqueiros because he's so like in a role where he tells the stories of indigenous people, and I just think that indigenous people have been neglected like forever, and I don't know. I just want to say it, and I guess I used that opportunity and just quoted Siqueiros in this piece, and also like the double cross, the fact that we're in the United States, and the fact that I don't know. I feel like the double cross. I don't know if I read it. Somebody told me, but I feel like the double cross it's about the betrayal of not only of the other countries, right, but also our own system in Mexico, and that's what it has, like the two horizontal pieces on the cross. But I also didn't want to. I also wanted to include the farm workers. So there's a portrait of a farm worker right here on this side.
Oh, it's very powerful. And Siqueiros is so great because right now we actually have some of his work on view. So this is a wonderful connection to be able to tie this in together. And I also have to say, he was radical with the use of his paint and radical with the use of his subject matters, and radical in the sense that he wasn't afraid to put it all out there. And I have to also say what is beautiful about this image in particular, if I remember correctly when I saw it, the actual boxes are the frame itself. So it is not totally rectangular. So it has this wonderful way of almost reading it. That they're not all straight, right?
No.
And then just tied to El Rey is one.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, I didn't realize that. It's a good segue. That's good. I think just going back to your original question about making the invisible visible. I think for me, Narciso was talking about like discovering kind of his sort of the people that he was painting and depicting once he started doing them on cardboard on these boxes. When I was growing up, I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. in the 80s. And I've told this story many times. I, really wanted to write, but I didn't know what that would lead to. Because, I was born into a household where, I'm the youngest of 11. Nobody went to school. My siblings barely graduated high school and got into lots of trouble. And I kind of was the weird exception to the rule because, I was born with a disability, and, my mother was really protective of me. So I knew early on that I had to use those. If I was going to survive, I was going to have to figure out how to use my brain. Right? Like I was going to, that's all I had. And I remember, being really attracted to words, to that feeling that you would get when you would read something powerful. Except, in high school, the things that I was reading were all old dead white guys, right? In England, wearing togas and stabbing each other in the back and marrying their moms. And so it was kind of where am I? Where are the people that look like me, right? So when I first started writing, my first short stories were always set in England. They always featured moats and cemeteries and, it was just really silly and frustrating, but it felt so necessary. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that was really powerful about that, though, is I would write these, crappy little stories. I mean, at the time, I thought they were brilliant, and I would give them to my siblings to read, and suddenly the world around us would stop spinning. And I think that's the power of art, right? Is whether it's visual art or creative, writing or whatever, the power that I think art has to force the world around us to stop for a minute. And I realized that the minute I could get the world to stop, I could interrogate it and question it. And I began to wonder why it was that I was looking around my community and seeing all of us who were poor and brown, working in, factories where we were losing our hearing, where we were getting crushed by, one time my brother was this giant, thing fell over him and crushed his leg and, just horrible things. And, and I began to question and interrogate why it is that people in my community are not going to college. They're not learning art. They're not learning writing. And it wasn't until I got to community college, which is why, I've told you, I'm a big proponent of community college because that was where I first encountered writers of color in a program called Puente. And I was like, holy shit, there's brown writers? What? And it was, it was an epiphany for me. And I think, that, and then I got really angry. I remember I got really mad because I felt why had this been kept from me? Right. So that was my, just going back to your question, that was, I guess, my beginning and how I started to make the invisible visible, right? And then when I got to UC Riverside and, took classes with writers, when my colleagues, people like Susan Strait, Susan was the one that told us early on, you don't really have to go far to tell meaningful stories. They're right here. And that's how I started with Stillwater Saints, that first novel, is I basically, kind of like what Narsiso was talking about in terms of sort of creating these images, right? I went in and created this community, this town that had actually existed but was wiped away by a flood in the 1860s called Agua Mansa. So I basically resurrected it and grafted it back onto the sort of larger map of Southern California in my attempt to resist erasure. I think my attempt to want to give visibility to the people that are out there that go on, working and picking and struggling, and being a necessary part of our economy. But oftentimes, I think we're taught as a consumerist culture to put that aside, right? To ignore it, right? But our art, I think, demands us, we can't not ignore it, right? We have to face it. And I think that's what makes work like Narsiso so important and necessary, is because it does hold a mirror out to society and forces us to look at what we're consuming and the cost, the real world cost, right? People's lives, right? They're people that pick those. It's not a machine. So So yeah, I think I'm going to keep doing that, making the invisible visible.
Well, it's profoundly important. But you also raised another thread that I'd like to go with, the sense of belonging, right? Finding art, writers, and works that speak to us, right? And it's really this breakthrough of being able to stand in a museum and to see your art there.
Yeah.
Actually, so to be able to see your books on a bookshelf. And to me, growing up, I longed for it.
Yeah.
It wasn't there. And so this is in many ways rather new.
Yeah.
And in it being new, I wanted to ask about that, creating that sense of belonging, Narsiso. We talked about that when we first met, and I just wanted you to share that, how important that is.
Well, yeah, I think I don't know. I feel like I want to go back to when I was 17, right? And in order for us to go to school, we had to go to a different town. I grew up in a very tiny community, but I remember turning 18, and then it was time for us to have our ID. And then in order for us to get our ID, we had to go to a bigger town. So I remember biking to that town, very excited. I was 18. And I got my ID with a picture of like myself in it. I was like, I felt like I belonged. Like I felt like I had an identity. I felt like I was someone. And I tied that to the farm workers because I feel like throughout the years that I work in the fields, the first half of, like, I worked in the fields for like 9 years or 10 years. Half of it was pretty much for the money. I was there working, following my brother and the crew. But the other half is that made me realize that I was part of the community. I left my brother. I went on my own to sort of like find myself again. And I looked for jobs on my own. I was introduced to different farm workers, like not only from Mexico, but other parts of the South America, Central South America. And I just realized that we were all having the same struggles. And a lot of them didn't speak the language. And when I discovered that with the art, I was able to make other people talk about farm workers, I feel like I wanted them to have a sense of belonging, because we just work. We just don't see what's happening around us. And usually farm towns are small towns where, well, at least where I worked up in Washington State, there was no opportunities for them to go to school and learn the language, and so we didn't know what's happening. We just worked. And I made it like I thought I wanted them to see the art that I was making. I wanted them to have that sense of belonging the same way I had it when I had my ID. And of course, because I was in school, I feel like my art or my audience went the other way. All of a sudden I see myself in museums and in galleries and I feel like farm workers were so like left on the side. So I started like pushing the other way around, and I started making vinyl prints to show in the actual farm working towns. I made calendars. As soon as I had the chance to show in farm working communities, I would say yes. I had one in Fresno. I had one in Seattle. I took as many people as I knew from fields, and just having the sense of just seeing the farm workers seeing themselves in art, it's just like a sense of it made me feel like all the struggle that I went through to get to where I am, it was worth it. Because they're seeing themselves in art. They're seeing themselves that what they're doing is important, that their contribution is necessary and important.
It reminds me when we think about Cesar Chavez and how important art was in the farm workers movement. 1965 to 1970, the longest strike in U.S. history. And I don't think it would have had the same impact if art wasn't a part of it, right? The posters and the theater, right?
Yeah.
It was right there in the back of the flatbed trucks. And it allowed farm workers to not only see themselves, but to laugh at some of the circumstances of the issues that were at hand, right? The boss and the lack of, in that, things have changed, but they're still very difficult. The lack of drinking water, the lack of toilets, the lack of breaks, the short-handled hoe it was still in use until 1973. So all of a sudden, all of these things, if art wasn't a part of it, I think the movement would have lacked so much. I mean, when we talk about the Chicano movement, we see the art as part of the way of didactic information being spread, all of a sudden making the invisible visible and creating a sense of belonging at probably the most difficult time. I couldn't imagine being on strike for 5 years.
Yeah.
The lack of security, the lack of understanding why it was taking so long, and the power that the landowners had on land that was once part of Mexico. The ironic issues that were all tied to that, and the native land in particular, because that's what we all stand on. Alex, you do a great sense of belonging in your work as well. Can you talk about it?
I think one of the things that was so significant for me, and you talked about going into a bookstore and seeing your work, or an art gallery and seeing your art hanging. I remember one time a student came up to me and told me she was reading my first novel was translated into Spanish, and they did a simultaneous Spanish and English release, which they hardly ever did. Major publishers never did that, and I was kind of this weird exception. They're like, yeah, we're going to do it in Spanish also. It's like, great, which is very exciting. But I remember I was at a book signing, and a young woman came up to me to have her book signed, and she said, my father only reads and speaks in Spanish, so he's reading the Spanish version while I read the English one, and we're talking about it. Right. Cool. And so I thought, how amazing is that? I think that as far as the idea of sort of belonging, I think more than anything, I just wanted to create characters and people who looked and acted like the people that I knew in my day-to-day reality and life. I think that when I got to graduate school, it was kind of a bit of a shock, because I looked nothing like any of my my peers. The other two men were in my group were white, and they were from the East Coast. They were very tall, had very blonde hair, and wore the requisite corduroy jackets with suede arm patches and the smart book bags. And I was this Mexican kid, from Tijuana. And I somehow managed to find myself in this writing program that was very elite and very well respected. And everybody was talking about Carver this and Nabokov that. And, and I just had no point of reference. I'm like, what the fuck are these people talking about? And I kind of went through that for a year. And then I finally realized I'm not going to pretend to know any of this, because I don't. And I'm going to lean on what I do know. I'm going to lean on what my strengths are as a writer. And at the time, my strengths were, I just wanted to write a book to be in conversation with all these other wonderful writers of color that I knew. It's I just wanted to do that. And, I think the problem with institutional learning, at the university when I teach at a university, I think the problem a lot of times is that we face as artists, and especially as artists of color or difference, while coming from marginalized backgrounds, is we go into these institutions and the first thing that they want to do is change us, right? That's you have to learn. So it's a very almost paternalistic and hostile right? So that's kind of what I kind of encountered when I got to graduate school. When I was an undergrad, it wasn't that. When I got to graduate school, it was like very much like, you got to learn it this way. And, I'm this bratty, kid brother, the youngest of 11. And I used to always just love picking fights with people. So I'm like, no, you're not going to do that to me. I'm going to write how I want to write. And I could really care less what you think. I don't know who Nabokov, I can know who Nabokov is now, but like, I don't know, the traditions of, Dostoevsky and Chekhov. And I know this though. I know this reality. I know these writers, and this is what I'm going to write. And so I think out of that sense of, loneliness and like absolute, like just desperation, I found my sense of belonging, right? And I think that eventually what ended up happening is I ended up, and kind of like what Narciso was talking about too, is like, you end up creating your art in such a passionate, honest, and very vulnerable way that people can't help but come to you, right? People can't help but start seeing what you're doing. And that's how you create a sense of belonging, right? Rather than me forcing myself onto people, I'm like, I'm just going to do what I do and trust that, like, somebody will respond. And it's worked ever since. So yeah, that's kind of what I do now. So just like, I'm going to write and do what I know how to do as best as I can. And with the faith and understanding that people will my book will find its way to the people that need to read it.
And that's a very powerful way to experience art. I know students have responded in that very profound, personal way with both your works. Mm-hmm. For me to have students tell me that, but we think about farm workers and we think about that as somebody perhaps we don't know, but to have a student say, that's my mom.
Yeah.
My mom actually does that. It stays with us, and it makes that invisibility very powerful when you can actually share it. And I think for students in particular, to have that experience, especially as they're trying to figure out, where do I go? What do I do?
Yeah.
Who am I? Right? What am I going to do when I have all these choices and I don't know what any of them mean? Right? I think it leads us to be able to have those connections that need to be made. Yeah. And that's what makes art so alive.
Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, if I could just add something to what you said, which was very eloquent, Melinda, was I think often as an educator too, is one of the things that worries me a lot is, and I fell into this trap when I was in college, was especially community college. My English teacher and counselor in this wonderful program that I was a part of, Puente, they kept telling me, you're such a great writer. You're such a great writer. You need to do something like this. But I was the first in my family to go to college, right? So I thought, well, there's no money in that. I need to study something that's going to make me money because I need to save my family. Like, I'm the first in my family to go to college. So I have to get a good job and make lots of money because I need to buy my mom a house and pull my whole family out of poverty, right? Not realizing that wasn't my job. My job was to do what I want to do. And I think a lot of times it worries me that I see a lot of particularly, Latinos who are from immigrant communities who, at where I teach, a huge first generation population of Latinx students who don't want to pursue art or the humanities because they don't see it like financially viable, right? So what worries me is we're losing a lot because sort of we got this ingrained sort of capitalist idea, right, about what education is. You have to go there and you have to study something that's going to make you money rather than making you happy, right? So it worries me a lot that, that I teach to this, this very diverse group. And, a lot of times my students are pursuing things that are not making them happy, but they're making them miserable because they think it's going to make them money. I'm like, but you're a great writer. It's like, yeah, but what's that going to do? Like, I don't know. What am I going to make? What am I make money doing that? Right. And I pushed my desire to write aside for a long time. And it caused me so much misery. It wasn't until I realized, like, I got to face it. I got to go back and study this because it's the only thing I know how to do. I can't paint. I can't sing. I can't play the piano. I can't I'm not good at math. And so it's like the only thing I had, right? And so I think a lot of times I worry because I do see that a lot of particularly Latinx, students who are resisting the arts and humanities because they think that that's not financially viable, right?
Well, it's a really hard one because so many of the families' parents have sacrificed so much.
Mm-hmm.
And that burden of responsibility that comes with that knowing, right?
Yeah.
What it's like to not have papers, knowing what it's like not to pay a bill because you have to put food on the table, knowing what it's like to have an unexpected emergency with a medical bill and having to negotiate all of this. Those are heavy things that many of our students carry. And they don't choose to carry it. It kind of reminds me of when I was growing up. My mother would always say, "The Lord will give you as much as you could bear." And I would say, "Yeah, this, honey, leave me alone. I have had my share."
Yeah,
and it's hard.
Yeah,
I'm just going to share this story with you because my father wanted to be an architect, and he realized nobody could be an architect if his name was Melinda Gandara. The mouthful, right? So he became an engineer. But he loved the arts, and he never really said it because he wanted us to have security.
Yeah.
And I went into art history, and he used to always say, "What are you going to do with that?" And I'm like, "I don't know, but I love it."
But I love it, yeah.
And it was only until he died and I went through his pockets, and at the very end of his career, he was a federal aid disaster going to places like New York City for 9/11, Katrina, Detroit. And all I found were all of the museums that he had gone to.
Oh, wow.
And that deep down, that art history was so much a part of his life, but he could never risk the financial uncertainty that he stuck with the thing that he knew at least he could provide security for. And I think these are hard things, not easy. And being an artist, I think the same thing for you probably.
Well, I think I was lucky that I went to school as an adult.
Okay.
Yeah. Even then, my family would pressure me to.
Yeah.
Because I finished high school when I was 29, so I was really old. But during my mid-20s, I was, struggling with English in high school. I went to an adult high school. And because of the culture of my family, it's like you get married in your early 20s. If you're a man, if you're a woman, in your late teens, you should be married. Otherwise, you te quedaste pa monja, So the pressure was like hard. And even when I was in the United States and they were in Mexico, they would call me and be like, "When are you gonna get married?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to school. Like, I think I want to have a career." "Oh, what are you going to school for? You were too old already." I stopped the conversations, or I would just keep it short, because I didn't want. I feel like those negative comments were affecting my thoughts of me wanting to go to school and have a career, when I already had established in my head that I wanted a career. I made it through community college. I knew what I wanted to study. After I couldn't study, I wanted to study science, biology, but I couldn't because I didn't have documents. So I went to the arts. I always draw since I was a kid, and I thought it was the opportunity for me to learn more about it and get better at it. And when my family found out that I was studying arts, it was the same question again, like, why arts? Can you be a teacher or a doctor, or a lawyer? And again, I just about that time I already had taken psychology 101, so I knew how to block everything. I knew how to be happy and be me, and I knew what I wanted. I was like, okay, I didn't feel bad for blocking people around me, and then. I went to the arts, and then my family somehow were okay with it or whatever. But then they saw that I was doing oil paintings, and they were excited about it. I was doing portraits, like the traditional way of oil painting. And then when they learned that I was painting on boxes, they're like, "Why question it again? Why boxes? Who's gonna buy that? How are you gonna make money?" But again, I think. Not only my family, but also people that I know around. But I think I was, I I never doubt my professors. I always knew, like, I don't think they know more than my professors. I don't think they know more than like all the researches that have been done and it's exposed in the art history books. And I knew what I was doing was my contribution, to my community, not only to my family, but my community as an immigrant, as an undocumented immigrant, as an indigenous person who like came out from this small little town to like, and got an education, and just like, because I remember my nephews and my nieces, and I wanted them to see that it is possible to have a college degree. Also, I was the first one in my family to go to community.
Well, taking that radical leap is always it's always gutsy. And I think it's so important because sharing your story will allow somebody perhaps to take that leap that they wouldn't have taken otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. And I think these are important ways to not only have access to the educational system, but to hear that our stories are part of that education. Right. That we can't separate them because of the importance. Right. And you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that going to your story, and the Sons of Notre Dame, he's on his deathbed and he's having to confront his life. And we only have one life.
Yeah.
So how are we going to make sense of the choices and the decisions that we make?
Yeah.
And sometimes taking a radical leap is
what's necessary.
Exactly.
Well, when you do that, I think you often run the risk of sort of, either alienating people or having people around you, kind of forcing you to question your choices, right? Like, well, maybe they're right, and because I faced a lot of that, when just like Narsiso, and I think it's funny, I have to point out, it's, when we talk about sort of this Latino identity and like how similar Narciso and I are, but how different, right? Like, like I never worked the fields, right? I was born in Tijuana, but pretty much raised. Like our experiences are so vast and different, right? We're not a monolith, and I think oftentimes that's like I feel like that's what people think when they think Latino is like we're all kind of the same. It's like we're not, or we have vastly different experiences, vastly different ideas and knowledge, and it comes out in our art, right? I think that it's important to recognize that, when you take a leap, an artistic leap, or when you try to pursue something that's still out of kind of the box, from your upbringing, you're going to run the risk of just having people sort of scratching their heads and being like, "What are you doing?" And if you can survive that scrutiny and still keep doing it, then I think you're going to be fine. So I tell my students, is like, any of my students come to me and they're like, my family doesn't get why I'm doing this, but it feels right. I'm like, you know what? You're going to be fine. Like the fact that you're worried, the fact that they're telling you you're still doing it, you're going to be fine. Trust me. Because if that's not dissuading you from doing it, then nothing will. Then you're absolutely on the right. Why didn't you give up?
Yeah.
Why didn't you just be like, you know what?
Yeah, my family is.
Tienen razón, right? Like, No, yeah.
Yeah. No, like you said, like, I think, like I said before, I think psychology one helped me tremendously. Like, honestly, like I learned about myself, about my culture, about the community, about my surroundings. And I was like, it's just me, it's me. And it's not my problem that they're not
getting it.
Yeah. It's me. Yeah.
Right. And I think the other thing too is that so many times when we have parents that perhaps my mother didn't go further and she never went to college. And so it was so foreign, right? Yeah. We were trying to explain some of the things that are happening. And she would always say, is that good? Is it? and it was always, I think these are important because our students, one of the things, we're not a monolithic group. We still have recent immigrants. We still have dreamers. We have a lot of differences with regards to even this Latin America.
Yeah.
It's a huge continent, and migration is natural. And I think this is going to be challenges that we're going to have to face, probably even more so now with what's going to happen in 2025. And I think our students are going to need us even more because they're going to be challenged on so many different ways.
Yes.
The rhetoric of language and Mexican being in many ways considered a derogatory term. And where are you in that placement of who you are, these identities?
No, for the long, I mean, growing up, I remember we would never tell people that we were born in Mexico growing up in the 80s because it was a source of shame. Right? Like you didn't say, to people that you were born, especially my generation, it was like we're sort of American, but not. And, but, I never told people that I was born in Tijuana. And, it was seen as a stigma, right? For a long time. And then also the frustrating thing was we would go to school and we're told not to speak Spanish, to speak English. But when we would come home, our parents would get mad at us for speaking English and would tell us to speak Spanish. So either way, we were part of my language, but we were like, right, either way. It's you just, and so, I mean, I grew up in that really weird generation where it was like, it's not cool to be Mexican, but, you gotta be American, but you're not American. And so that's where, when I started writing, I was like, no, I was born in Tijuana. Because I spent decades trying to hide who I was. Right? And it just gets tiring after a while. It's like, I'm old. I don't want to, I like those, when those old people are honest, like honest old people, like, why do you come up to you, why do you say that? Yeah, that's kind of what I want to be. Like, I'm getting there right now. It's like, you're just moving too slow. Get out of my way. Because it's just like, it's tiring. It's tiring to hide and to cower. And, you're not going to be able to mass deport us. Oh, sorry. You're just not. And, it's just silly of anybody to think that you can round up a bunch of people and, that's not how, that's not how this world works. We're so ingrained and enmeshed in the culture of the US that it's like, one can't live without the other. So, and the difficulties, the policies that sort of dictate our lives, the edicts, the poison from politicians. These are the things that artists, we have to face, right? These are the things that we have to call out, that we have to paint, right? That we have to give a visual representation of. It's hard. It's hard to do that. It's hard to write about, an old man dying, and all these secrets because his culture told him that he couldn't be something, right? It's hard to do that, but we have to, we have to. We can't not. I don't know what got me on that. I'm sorry. I don't know what. I think it was the red velvet pancakes that crushed Patsy. Patsy knows about my love for those pancakes. Holy crap. Has anybody been there? Yeah, been there? Oh my God. Go get those red velvet pancakes. I think it's the sugar. So anyway.
But I have to agree, like whenever I'm painting like a scene of farm workers where I have to paint, because I mostly use images that I took myself and I know most of the people that I paint. And whenever I'm painting someone, my memory goes back to that person, to that instance where I took the photograph. And then my head starts thinking about that person and then all the stories that I know about that person. And it makes it difficult to paint.
Yeah.
My eyes get watery and I can't draw. Like I just have to leave it for a minute. And at least one occasion, I completely stopped drawing because of the emotions that would come out with the subject matter I was painting. And I feel like I didn't paint that scene at all. I did something. I combined some of those stories with the different images that I had in order for it to come true.
Yeah.
Because the original was so difficult to paint.
Yeah.
But I know what you're saying.
I had a similar experience and I had a lot of experiences like that when I'm writing. It's like you're writing these things. It's like, why am I so dark and like intense? I want to write about like puppies and some buddies and like, why do I have to write about all this like death all the time and struggle? I remember when I was working on my second novel, The Five Acts of Diego León. It's about it touches on the Cristero Rebellion, which is a civil war between the church and the state in Mexico. And Graham Greene wrote about it in The Power and the Glory and all that. And I read this account of these when the popular opinion for the Cristeros, who were fighting kind of on the side of the church against the government, turned, was when a group of Cristeros stopped a train. This was in Mexico in the 30s. They stopped a train full of civilians because they thought there was like gold on it, and then there wasn't. So what they did is the historical account says they boarded up the doors to the train car where the people were inside, and these are civilians, and then they doused it with gas and lit it on fire.
Damn.
And I was writing this scene with my character, who's kind of going, and the same thing happens. And I remember it was like midnight, and I was in my robe, and I wrote this horrible scene, and I stopped. And I was like, what am I doing? And I just walked around my house in my robe for like an hour. And my dogs were like, are you okay? Like, no, I'm not, but I think that's the job of the artist, right? Is to confront those moments that are hard, because it's our job to articulate it, right? It's our job to put a face to it, so that we can hold this up and say, look what's happening. This is where your food's coming from. These are the people that are crossing the border. These are the people that are living right next door to you, who are just struggling and have hopes and dreams just like everyone else, and are just as their ideas and their lives are just as valid as anybody's. That's
Absolutely. I think, Narciso, when you were talking about that, these people, that we remove that statistic and we remove all of these ways in which they've been grouped, right? And to make them individuals that have actual stories that are there to be told. I've always thought that art, it can be very prescient, that it has the ability to give us the ability to see things that we don't see otherwise. And there is a lot of power with that. What I'd like to do is take another look at one of your paintings. Can you talk about this one? Is it you?
Well,
I guess. Sorry. Yeah, that's a self-portrait.
It's a self-portrait, right?
Self-portrait.
Well, I don't know. I think when I did this piece, I don't usually do self-portraits. Unless it's going to help the composition of the piece. And if there's no other image, I'll use myself. Sometimes I'll pose. Sometimes I'll use an actual image that someone took of me in the fields. The title is I forget the title. Self-portrait on a cherry, with strawberry fields in the background. Strawberry fields forever in the background, or something like that. But like you see, it's hard to see it, but I had headphones on this image, and I can't remember what the song I was listening to at that time. But when I was working on this piece, I was listening to La Santa Cecilia, Strawberry Fields Forever. And that's why I titled it that. I think that the Strawberry Fields Forever is like a story that tells how important farm workers are in the food industry, and I don't know. I think I was thinking about me being not literally harvesting cherries, but also harvesting the product of all the hard work that I've gone through. Like since I went to English school, get all my general education, and then go to college and have a degree, and I think it was one of the first pieces that was sold to a museum. And so in my head, I was just like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, all these thoughts of making it really, and just look forward and not so much to the past. You see all those dry leaves that are in the background. It's like all these little metaphors that I've had in my head. I don't know if I explain all that and like in the actual paper that I wrote for this piece, but that's what I was thinking. That's what I was thinking. And I don't know.
So, Narciso, how much weight would you say you're carrying if you had that filled?
I don't know. Maybe, I'm not sure, 30, 40 pounds.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But I think it's not so much the weight, but the bulkiness of it. I think that's what bugs when people are picking cherries. They have to go up and down the ladders with it. And there's so many wires on the ground. People trip with it sometimes. I think the bulkiness is that bugs the most. I think picking cherries is quote unquote most of the fun things in the fields, because it's not that heavy, and people make you only work for people work only for a short period of time because of the heat. It cannot be picked if it's too hot because of the stems come off the actual cherries. Well, actually, it's not that fun because I'm just thinking now, like you see, I'm wearing goggles, but I'm not wearing like my bandana. A lot of the times, these trees have like this thin film of pesticides in it, residues in it, and it smells really bad, and it hurts your throat, and people have to make a choice whether you want to wear a bandana or goggles, because it's hard to work with both of them. Either the goggles get foggy, it's hard to breathe going like really fast, and it's just sad that people have to, expose themselves to that because of, in order to make some money.
Yeah, we forget that, our skin is the largest organ in our body, and it's so susceptible to pesticides and fungicides and all of the transmissions that go through. I think one of my favorite pieces is by Esther Hernandez, who works with the same kind of issue with regards to taking the sun mad raisin comes to mind as an image, and I'm sorry I didn't bring some of those images as a way of, again, confronting the unhealthy aspect of what it is to be in picking, right? Picking these things. And the other thing is, we have to remember, you're paid by the container, how much you pick from them, to so much of a degree.
You mentioned Esther Hernandez. I taught a couple of weeks ago. I taught in one of my creative writing seminars I'm teaching. I taught Elena Viramontes' Under the Feet of Jesus.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And one of my students, we were talking about the fantasy versus the reality of a lot of the fruit crate art, the fruit crate labels, or it's like, that sort of present this sort of bucolic, beautiful landscape, right? These old fruit crates. And somebody brought up the sun-made raisin, the how she looks all happy and, with the bonnet on her head. And the reality is it's like this complete antithesis of that. But those fruit crate labels are interesting because they do sort of sell this very sort of pristine, clean, very European, very white sort of conception of what like agriculture is, right? When we know that it's far from that, right? And so I think it's really bold of somebody like Narciso to take these sort of, cardboard things and sort of grasp, this reality onto it. It's a very bold statement.
Yeah, well, there's a palimpsest as well.
Yeah.
You can actually see through some of the background. And I always think reading, organic, right? All of a sudden that becomes much more of a buzzword with regards to value, right? and yet somebody still has to pick it. Somebody still has to do all of that work. And I have to say that it is a humbling experience to be raised in a place where you do see all this agriculture. Even in Riverside, all of the oranges that used to be in those fields and what have not. And anybody who's ever driven Highway 5, when I would go drive with my husband, I could pick out the trees. I said, "There's almonds." He goes, "How do you know?" And I said, "I know." There's walnuts. It's grafted, and now with so much of the water usage and with the drought that we had in California in particular, still may be problematic. This is big ag. This isn't small-time farmers with a small label. This is corporations maximizing profit. And when you talk about cherries, it's so interesting. I was raised with some cherries, and the farmer never had them go into the U.S. market. They were competing for Japanese as well as the Chinese market, as well as the Russian market. And they would come to bid off the Rainier cherries.
Yeah.
So it's all these layers that people don't even know about.
Yeah.
We just think that we can go in there and buy our cherries. All right?
So I'm going to
interrupt
slightly what is a beautiful conversation, because I believe there are many people here that long.
Oh my God.
Oh, yeah.
I don't.
It just went off.
Absolutely. I don't want to take that away from anybody.
I want to make sure if you have a question that you have a chance to ask it now and then, and just raise your hand. I'm not going to run around with microphones because I always think that's sort of silly. Yeah, just talk loudly.
Okay, I just want to say for the record, like when I mentioned my family or people that I know, like trying to dissuade me from this, I feel like they did it from the heart.
Yes.
And I just want to say and acknowledge how grateful I am for their support economically, specifically.
Because they cared about you.
That's all I want to say.
Any questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm one of your former students.
We've never met in person.
Oh, wow.
Excited to be here for you, and thank you guys so much for your words. It's really inspiring. I have a question for Narsiso. If you are able to answer, it's pretty. Anyway, so I'm an aspiring writer, like songwriter, and we mentioned how you did oil paintings on canvas, and then it kind of went the museum route, like kind of a way of what you wanted to focus on with the performers. And then you told your family that you were doing it on boxes, and they were like, "Wait, what are you doing? You should have done the other way." So I wanted to kind of ask you how you kind of battle that pressure of, instead of going mainstream and like pursuing museums and the fame of it, and how you stay grounded to keeping where the message should stay and recognize that you have this gift, but like keeping it of where you came from, and honoring the people who are still there.
Thank you. Well, psychology 101. No, but I think I feel like understanding our own selves and where we're coming from is that keeps us grounded with our goals. I think, because like I said, at first I didn't understand. I was half the time in the fields. I was making it I was there for the money. I did not pay attention to who was working around me. I would just follow my brother. I would get my paychecks, come to LA, and just go to school. And the second part, the second half it was when I was in the graduate studies, and because of the nature of the research paper, I had to investigate. I have to get to know more about the farm workers, and that's when I got reconnected with my community. I learned about more farm workers and their struggles, and I learned that it was my struggle. We spoke the same language. We had similar stories, and that's when I thought that wasn't fair. Like the system wasn't being fair with the farm workers in terms of like wages and working conditions and how they treat them, and I thought that all those things needed to be said. and I couldn't speak out for them at that time in the fields. I couldn't even speak out for my own self when people would mistreat me. So art was a way for me to speak about it. And I thought that was important. I made it my goal, and that's what kept me rooted to it. I think when I had my first real conversation about farm workers and agribusiness, when I did my first piece on cardboard, that's when I understood that that was making it worth going to school and going through all the sacrifices, because it was not about myself anymore only. It was about the community. It was about my coworkers. And I think that's what kept me rooted until today. Like the fact that I'm keeping a conversation about the unfairness that farmers have to go through, and also that it's a contribution that I'm making to the community. I think that's my mentality right now. And first, I was not necessarily there for the money. I went like 2 years without selling any piece of artwork, but the fact that people were talking about it, to me, that was important. That was valid. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you guys for paving the way, for making it less scary.
Yeah.
I guess this question is more directed towards Alex on the topic of the Sons del Rey. It's just, I personally found lucha libre as a sort of like metaphor, but also like vehicle of expressing gender and sort of like the association with responsibility of maintaining gender roles, so avoiding the public expressions of queerness. Very fascinating and very like easy to relate to. I was just curious to know, like, how did you come upon this? Like, is lucha libre a part of like your family's history, or how did this sort of like come upon you?
In the book?
Yeah, just the idea.
The idea of it? Well, okay, it was kind of a bit of a joke. Well, no, I was angry. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. So back in 2013, the second novel came out, The 5 Acts of Diego Leon, and it tanked. You know, it was a failure. A part of that had to do with the fact that my publisher, Random House, at the time gobbled up Penguin. So I kind of got lost in the shuffle and got moved around. The book came out and nobody really did anything with it. Nobody paid attention to it. And I was really upset because I felt like this was I was writing about a Latino actor in Hollywood during the 20s and 30s. Right? Like, how cool. Right. Yeah, right. So, and so I was really bummed out when it came out, and the reception was just kind of, and I spoke with one of my professors, and she said, my former professor, she said, well, the only thing you can really do is work on the next book. And so right around this time, one of those guys that I mentioned that I went to school with the suede, we got the jackets and the suede, So he sold a novel to Simon & Schuster, my now publisher, ironically, about 3 generations of an Irish American family in Brooklyn, New York, and he got like a 7-figure advance. He made tons of money. And I was having this conversation with my partner, and I said, it would be so funny. Can you imagine New York paying me $1 million to write 3 generations of a Mexican-American family? No, they wouldn't do that. And so I started thinking, what tacky, silly, cultural cliche can I attach to it? I was like, Loteria's been done. People have written short stories around each character in Loteria. La Llorona, everybody knows that. And so I thought, lucha libre, how funny would that be? Wait a minute. And so I started thinking there's actually something here that I could write, and I can interrogate, toxic masculinity and the idea of machismo and this culture that is so staunchly one or the other, the fluidity that exists, right? the ways in which men of my generation were so reluctant to seek, mental health, to talk about their feelings and their emotions, right? The secrets that they carried, a lot of the men, in my family, my uncles, and, carried a lot of secrets. A lot of them were, in the closet and couldn't do anything about it. So I actually started meditating on that, and I realized like there's actually something I could say about, the idea of also like brown bodies. And I think Narciso does this in his work so well, is the idea that like brown bodies are expendable, right? The brown immigrant body is one that is, pushed and pulled and tugged in multiple ways and mangled through labor, right? Through the spectacle of performance, through the spectacle of sexuality, right? Because one of the things I also wanted to explore in the book was the way like sexuality itself is performative, right? So it kind of came about that way. I was at a low point in my writing career, and I thought it was the end. And I thought lucha libre, like nobody's written about it. Nobody's used it as a central, theme in a literary novel. So why not? And then I was writing it, and then I wrote my nonfiction book, Cruising. That kind of came in, and I wrote that, and then I had to put it, once it came out, I threw the novel away, and then once Cruising came out, and I moved everything, then I came back to it. So it was a 10-year process to write that book.
Right.
Yeah. I feel like I scratched the surface. I still feel like there's so much more I want to write about that whole culture, because it's really fascinating. And I also wanted to give it a legitimate treatment, I think, because usually when people think about lucha libre, they think like cheesy, kind of corny, Nacho Libre and like, the masks. And it's all kind of not really taken seriously, but there's a rich history there, a really fascinating one. And I really wanted to pay homage to that.
Yeah. Yes.
I came today because I saw Narciso's work on arts and lectures at PBS. We watched PBS NewsHour, and at the end they always had interesting stuff. But this was the most interesting thing I'd ever seen, and I absolutely loved the box painting. You've talked about it in various ways, but it's what really hits hard goes beyond words. There's something about what you've done that truly goes beyond words for me. So you can send me a royalty check. I call Charlie James. Yeah, because I was so enthralled. And I don't buy a lot of art. I'm not a wealthy woman. And I found him in LA, Chinatown. Has your work. And I said, I want to buy something. I want to buy it. I can't afford an original oil painting. What have you got? So I bought, and he set it up so sweet, packaged it beautifully, set it up. I got a print of your nieces on the porch with the trailer so that they lived in it in the shadow of their college graduation. And I'm like you in the first one of 27 grandchildren in college. And my folks never graduated high school, but they did really well. My dad became an engineer in the aerospace industry, even though he had no college graduation. And he was the, model Latino employee. And he did it. He took it. He kept his mouth shut and did his job. And so it's just, your work just brings up so much history. So thank you so much.
Of course.
Now, are you able to do this? It's a personal question, but is this work going to really sustain you? Is it you said museums are buying your work. I'm thrilled. Is it around the country or where? How broad?
Yeah, I think it's throughout the country. Yeah, I think I'm lucky to have found an agent that helped me put the work out there. And that piece that you're talking about, To a Brighter Future.
Yes.
I feel like for me, that's my hope for the future generations, not only like for farmworks, but for the Latino community to go to school and have a college degree. I feel like there's nothing wrong like working in the fields, but having a college degree, having a college degree makes us more encourage us to have that to demand better work conditions or better wages, and to understand that our position within the system.
Are you familiar with Karen Walker's work in Black culture? That blows me away, and I think you're in the same. There's a little compliment. I think you are in her league of making important art.
Thank you.
Well, I'm just going to tell real fast, real quickly. His piece is, you have a piece at LACMA, LA County Museum of Art. And so we are going to have this kind of presence. And I think it's so important. I'm giving a little props to you because you're not doing it yourself. I think we had another question. I'm sorry.
I just had a quick comment. I'm just going to say thank you so much for doing what you guys do. I'm first generation. My parents were from Mexico, so I was the translator, we were the translator at third, fourth grade, and the importance was very different in our culture at the time. We weren't immersed in our culture, Mexican culture, more American culture, but we were more Americanized, but not really. Yeah. Because our parents didn't know the language. And so I grew up basically with the mindset of, I gotta do everything myself. So I didn't start school until very later. And I tried to let Dad that I introduced you to my daughter. And I said, you have to take this book. You're 7 years old, and I finally found somebody that I can connect with. So I just thank you because my daughter's in the arts, and I best thing to do is let them follow it. Yeah. My baby, she's a singer. Dancer. Oh, good. So I'm very excited to see what she comes up with. My younger one is in college right now, and she wants to do business, but also dance. Let them do what they need to do. You guys are inspiring, and they're going in the right direction, and just keep going.
Well, I'm just going to give a shout out to you because it was a mother-daughter that I had in my class.
Oh, wow.
And I kept thinking, somebody's got to write an article on this because it was such a wonderful way. And both of you, I only know you online, but I felt like I know you. I mean, when you said Erica, I'm like, oh my gosh, I know exactly who I'm talking to.
I worked at Santa Barbara City College, so we were doing stuff for the school that we had to do as employees and faculty. And she was in with my roots, and I was like, I just had to share it. Yeah. I said, I'm a girl fan over here. I know this right down in your class, and she responds. She does completely opposite. So it was just, I did this project with a friend of mine who got her a PhD, where it was just paths to college, and she just wanted my perspective. She did a bunch of this, and she got me work for it. And my perspective was basically I was in a bubble. I just left myself in a bubble and just did my thing, and things were done because that's the way they're supposed to be done. And I didn't do anything extra. I didn't do. And with the first administration that blew my bubble, then I found your classes during COVID, and then I just was like, it was broken. We're out there. We're going to do this. And thank you guys for paving the way, but because I want to say that's kind of like the language that everybody understands. Oh yeah. Yeah. But just looking at that picture is like, boom. You're going to understand that.
I just want to say thank you, not only to the three of you on the stage, but to everyone in this room, because something happened today that often happens with art, which is that stories evolve, and the permission to tell our own story becomes palpable. Yeah. It's not easy to do that. So thank you for the art that you make that allows us to feel that way, for the conversation we had today. Thank you, all of you, for coming on a beautiful afternoon to go forward.
And thank you, Patsy, for everything that you do here.
It's our privilege to do that, and make this be for so many such conversations. So thank you.
Thank you.